Video, we're going to discuss fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is when the government uses its power to spend money and to tax to achieve macroeconomic objectives, such as achieving full employment or sustaining economic growth or stabilizing the price levels and trying to reduce inflation. Now, Congress gets its authority to use the budget process and taxing and spending to achieve macroeconomic objectives from the Employment Act of 1946. So the responsibility for taxing and spending, the two main levers of fiscal policy, reside with the Congress. The Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan group that works for the Congress and helps them analyze budgetary suggestions and tax policy and other economic issues. The Congressional Budget Office does not make policy recommendations. The Council of Economic Advisors is in the executive branch and helps the president and the cabinet and the public understand economic issues, including issues that are involving taxes and spending and fiscal policy. So the federal budget is the process by which the Congress and the president work to establish how much money we're going to receive in taxes and other ways of raising money, and then how much money we're going to spend in each given year and where it's going to be spent. So when they put the budget together, it's really a statement about all of the outlays the government makes and all the revenues and taxes they expect to collect. And there's really two objectives that they have when they're putting the budget together. The first one is to pay for the activities of the federal government, such as operating the military and the court systems and all of those types of things. But they also are trying to achieve certain macroeconomic objectives, as we discussed, maintaining full employment, providing for economic growth, and trying to reduce and keep inflation to a minimum. So the calendar that they use starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th of the following year. So when we're talking about a year for the federal government with regards to the budgetary process, it goes from October 1st to September 30th of the following year. That's the fiscal year for the federal government. And the process normally starts out in the beginning of the year in January with the president making a recommendation or a request for a budget, which gets sent to Congress, and Congress goes through and evaluates the suggestion and holds hearings and makes changes, and then they finalize something which will be passed as a law, which the president signs before the next fiscal year. So if we look at the federal budget, we can see that there's that in this chart here, we have some actual numbers for 2020 and then some projections for 2021 and beyond. Let's take a look at 2020 and what happened. And you'll see that the revenues for 2020 were about $3.4 trillion. Most of that came from individual income taxes and individual payroll taxes, meaning the taxes on people that work. A very small amount came from corporate income taxes. If we look at the spending that was done, you can see that we spent a lot more in outlays in 2020 than we brought in 2020. So we spent $6.5 trillion against revenues and taxes of only $3.4 trillion. So we spent $3 trillion more in 2020 than we brought in. Most of that went into mandatory spending, and almost $4.5 trillion of that $6.5 trillion was mandatory spending, and then about $1.6 trillion is discretionary spending that can change from year to year, and $345 billion was spent on interest on previous borrowings and debt. So you get an idea that of how much money we spend, how much money we bring in, where the money comes from and where it goes, and then what some of the projections are for some of the following years. And the important thing to see on this chart is that we spent a lot more money in 2020, $3 trillion more than we brought in revenues and taxes. That was largely due to the coronavirus and the spending associated with trying to deal with the coronavirus. If we go back to 2019, before the coronavirus happened, and some of the previous years, we were spending about $1 trillion more in 2019 than we brought in. So we can safely assume that about $2 trillion of the $3 trillion that we spent above what we brought in was related to coronavirus. So let's look at the federal government and the where the money goes to. This is for the year 2019, but the proportions are similar for the current years. About 25%, 24%, 1/4 of the budget goes to Social Security, which for the most part is the insurance program, the retirement payments for older people. Another 26% went to Medicare and Medicaid, which is health insurance for older people and health insurance for lower income people. So more than half the budget is spent on retirement for older people and health insurance for older people and low income people. And that's a pretty big number. And these are what are considered mandatory programs, meaning if somebody is above 65 and qualifies for Social Security, then the government has to pay it. That's what mandatory means. They don't really have the discretion to say yes or no. And so you can see that more than half of the spending is mandatory programs. If we look at defense spending, it's about 15% of the total budget, and interest in 2019 was 9%. It's been in that range, 9-10% for some time because we have a large federal debt, as you'll see in a minute. So this gives you an idea of where the money goes to. Most of it goes to government programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then about 15% of the budget goes to defense, and about 10% goes to paying off interest on the debt. Now, if we look over a period of time, we can see the composition of the spending is changing. If we go back to the 1960s, about 2/3 of the budget was discretionary, and a little 28%, a little more than a quarter was mandatory. And as we go through time, the mandatory amount goes up and the discretionary amount goes down. At this point, we're probably getting close to having 2/3 mandatory spending and 1/3 of non-mandatory spending, made up of interest on debt and discretionary spending. And the difficult part of this is when the spending's mandatory, we don't really have very much control over it, and which creates problems in terms of trying to be balance budgets and be financially responsible. So it's definitely the case that the budget is shifting to from more discretionary spending to more mandatory spending and very little discretionary spending. Okay, so let's look at the budget for 2020. This is the proforma budget before the year started. This is where they started out when they approved the budget. You basically had an expectation of $4.79 trillion in spending, $3.71 trillion in revenue, and just over a little more than $1 trillion deficit. So we'd be spending almost a little more than $1 trillion more than we brought in. And the years prior to 2020 were kind of similar to this. And what happened? Well, the year went on. We had the COVID-19 virus, the pandemic, and Congress spent a lot of money trying to deal with the coronavirus. They passed the CARES Act, which was $2.3 trillion of spending. That was in addition to a large amount of spending that found its way through the Federal Reserve Bank and the monetary system, And so there was something like $6 trillion in spending overall in coronavirus. And basically it made the budget, it kind of broke the budget. So this is where the the $3.1 trillion in debt for 2020 comes from. About 2 trillion of that is related to coronavirus. We were supposed to have a debt of $1 trillion, and we wound up having a deficit rather, of $3.3 trillion. So we, even though we projected to have more spending than tax revenue, we had way more spending than tax revenue. $3.3 trillion more spending than tax revenue. And we can look at 2021 again in the beginning. This is our kind of estimate that we're going to bring in revenues of 3.8 trillion, spend 4.8 trillion, and have just under $1 trillion in deficit that would be added to the debt for 2021. And again, this is before the year starts. As time goes on, we see that we are still dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. In March of 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion of stimulus. And so we can see that we're already, the idea of having a deficit of less than $1 trillion is probably not realistic, given that we're by March we're already adding $1.9 trillion in stimulus spending, and that's only one fourth of the way through the year. So the expectation for 2021 is it'll probably be similar to 2020. And if we go back to the budget expectations in this chart, we can see that's exactly what we're showing. 2020 had a $3.1 trillion deficit, and 2021 is showing a $2.2 trillion deficit. This number may be larger. I doubt it will be smaller. It may be larger, and you can see we have the expectation as we get into 2022 and 23, these numbers will start going down, similar to what they were before the coronavirus pandemic hit. So certainly the coronavirus pandemic has been an unusual time, from every respect, but unusual from the standpoint of the budget and government spending as well. So let's get back to where we were. We can see that if we look at United States federal expenditures and receipts, going back to the founding of the country over 200 years, we see that for a long time the spending was rather low. Of course, we have these are the dollars were different back then, but the point here is the spending and the receipts, the spending and the taxes were similar, and certain times maybe when this is World War II, maybe the spending is a little higher, but then it's about on average. We have a dip here in the 70s, a little bit, and so then we see in the 1970s a real change here. Now we see a deficit starting to be kind of regular, and each and every year. And so from this period of time in the 1960s all the way to today, really there's only been 3 years where the budget has been balanced, and in every other year we've ran deficits. Now initially the deficits were smaller. You can see here through the 1980s, and then when we get up into about 2000, the deficits start to become very large. And $500 billion, and then $1 trillion, and now we're in the $2 and $3 trillion range. So this is this kind of shows how in the last 20 or 25 years we've been expanding the deficit every year and expanding the debt as a result. And the troubling aspect of this is we seem to be doing it every year. It's not like it's happening some years, and especially in bad times like trying to fight the pandemic. It's happening every year, whether there's a pandemic or not. And so this is a troubling aspect about the deficits. They seem to be chronic and getting larger. So we can see on another chart here an idea of what these deficits look like. This goes back to 1900, and again, there really weren't deficits. Up until the 1970s, there was a small deficit here for World War One, World War II. There were some deficits, but these were based on the wars, and they were temporary. And then we kind of got back into balance. It's only when you get into the 1970s when the deficits start to become chronic and larger, and then you can see there's a little bit of surplus here, and then just these huge deficits, $500 billion, $1 trillion, $2 trillion and more. And this, by the way, only goes up to 2019. If we put 2020 and 21, the red line will be all the way down here to the bottom. So this is just another example to show you how in the last 20, 25 years, we've really started to run chronic deficits. The deficits are getting larger, and this is and this is problematic from an economic and finance perspective. Here's another view of the deficits. You saw that they were in the couple $100 billion range in the 2000s. After the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, we had some very big deficits. They started to come down a little bit, but they started to increase as well. And you can see already this chart was made in 2015, and so this is actually a little bit before. This is before the coronavirus. Again, the coronavirus would be off the charts here for 2020 and 2021. Just another example, another chart showing you how the debt and the deficits in the last number of years have been growing. Now, if we add all this up, what we see is that these deficits that we've been running, these chronic deficits in the last 25 years, we've accumulated $28 trillion of debt. And you can see on the chart on the right here, again, this goes back to 1900. We really had no debt. Then we had a very, very small debt. And starting around 1970s, it increased. And when we get to 2000, it just explodes. And so this is just another. This is the accumulated view of this. When we show the last couple of charts, we show the deficit, which is how much more we're spending than we're bringing in each year. And again, they're chronic and they're growing. This is the debt, which is how much we're adding to the amount we owe. And if you look at this number in the around 2000. The debt was around $4 trillion. And then if you go into 2008, it was about $8 trillion. And then if you go to 2016, it was 16 or $17 trillion. And so it seems to be doubling every 8 years or so. And then, of course, it took us less than 8 years to double it, probably from the time by the time we get to double it again. So this is a huge problem. Now, $28 trillion, just to put that in perspective, these are big numbers. They're sometimes hard to get your head around, but if we put it in perspective, if we took $1 million bill, $1 million $100 bills, I'm sorry, $1 million worth of $100 bills, it would be as tall as a chair. If we took $1 billion in $100 bills, it would be tall as the world's tallest building. And then if we took $1 trillion in $100 bills, it would be 631 miles high, 2.5 times the height of the International Space Station. And we've got 28 trillion of these. So it's a tremendous number that it's a tremendous, the $28 trillion debt. It not only sounds like a big number, it is a big number. And one of the common things people often say is, well, this is not really a problem because we kind of owe it to ourselves. But this is not really true. If you look, this is a breakdown of where the $28 trillion, who we owe it to, who borrowed it from us. And many a lot of private pension funds and state and government and retirement funds and many of the mutual funds that we have are holding some of this debt and wanting and expecting it to be paid back. There's some foreign governments that hold our debt, including the four biggest are Japan, China, the UK, and Ireland, but there's a few others. But if you notice, more than half the debt is held by other parts of the United States government. The Federal Reserve Bank, the Social Security Administration, and various government retirement funds hold almost $17 trillion of the $28 trillion in debt. And so, again, this is another, this is the kind of thing that if it wasn't the government do it, if you or I did this in our personal lives, we might be going to jail in terms of, this is not the way this is normally done. So the point here is that we do, it's not really accurate to say we owe this to ourselves as real people, including all of us who are holding some of this debt, sometimes directly, but if not directly, then certainly indirectly through our pension funds and our retirement funds and mutual funds and things like that. So the notion that we don't really owe this to anybody is really not is really not something that we can say is true. There's another aspect to this. There's a significant generational imbalance. These chronic deficits and this chronic debt is not really going to be paid off by the current generation. It's going to be paid off by people in the future. The current generation's children and grandchildren are most likely going to have to deal with this problem. So this is another dimension, this generational imbalance, the fact that are people who maybe not have been people who are either children now or maybe not even born yet are the ones going to have to bear the consequences and eventually figure out how to pay this debt. Now, we look at the 28 trillion, and that you probably think, okay, the story can't get worse, but it can, because that's just the debt that's on the books now, the stuff that we've already borrowed, and in reality, there's more. If we look at all the obligations that we have, these are our current obligations we have that we just haven't had to borrow for yet. All the mandatory spending that's in, the future years, the actual debt that we have, the amount of money that we have to pay, that it is probably in excess of $100 trillion, really 5 times or 4 times the current value of our current GDP. So the problem, the more you look at the problem, the bigger the problem gets, and that's one of the fundamental issues here. Now, not all the spending that gets done is done by governments, is done by the federal government. In fact, most of the government that we know, that we experience, is state and local government. The police and the roads and bridges and the fire departments and the schools and education are largely done by local governments and state governments. And so if we look at the amount of spending that's done at the local state level, it's another $2.9 trillion. Now, state and local governments don't have the option that the federal government has. They really have to balance their budgets. And the reason is because they're not able to print money. One of the ways that we've been able to run up these huge deficits and chronic deficits and accumulate as much debt as we have is that we can print money, if you will. And that's what's going on here with the Federal Reserve Bank holding about $10 trillion of debt. That's so. This is what printing money looks like. It's one part of the government holding debt from another part of the government, and but state and local governments cannot do that. So you don't see. In some cases, you'll see some problems with deficits and with debt, but states, because they can't print money, are not really able to do what the federal government can do, and so they have to reconcile or resolve budget issues, sooner rather than later. Now, let's take. We talked a little bit about the budget and spending. let's look a little bit at how fiscal. So the question is, okay, what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is using spending and taxation as a way of achieving macroeconomic objectives, minimizing unemployment, creating economic growth, stabilizing price levels, and fighting inflation. So we have two tools to do that: spending and taxes. And the question is, well, what when we do fiscal policy, what gets affected? And the answer really is everything. It can affect employment, it can affect GDP and GDP growth, it can affect the composition of GDP, how much spending happens in different components or subcomponents of the GDP. It affects aggregate demand, aggregate supply, interest rates, debt, inflation, the distribution of wealth in future generations. So the answer is fiscal policy affects everything. That's why it's so important in a sense, because everything gets affected by fiscal policy. Now, most discretionary fiscal policy focuses on its efforts on increasing aggregate demand, and this goes back to the ADAS model and Keynes's general theory. The idea that if we are trying to have more economic activity and more employment, the way to do that is to have more demand. That's the way to increase economic activities, to increase aggregate demand. And the fiscal policy makers, the Congress, has two ways of doing that. They have two levers. The first one is government expenditures, government spending. And the second one is tax policy. So they can either spend more or less money as a way of having more economic activity or less economic activity, or they can decrease taxes or increase taxes as a way of having more economic activity or less economic activity. Now, when they increase taxes, they can use some of the increased tax revenues to do some government spending. So it winds up being, you can wind up affecting two things at one time, which we'll take a look at. But that's really the overall approach here. We use fiscal policy, spending, and taxation to achieve a macroeconomic objective, and most of the time, we're trying to increase aggregate demand. So fiscal stimulus is one of the ways we do that, and fiscal stimulus can be either automatic or discretionary. So sometimes there's the way the law is written. If certain economic events happen, well, then certain fiscal stimulus things will be kicked off. So if you have a certain tax incentives, if people qualify for the tax incentives, then they're able to get them. It happens automatically. And then other times we have discretionary fiscal policy. These are actions initiated by Congress. This is what the American Rescue Plan was, the $1.9 trillion bill passed in 2021. This is what the CARES Act, the $2.3 trillion stimulus package passed in 2020. The American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act were designed to stimulate the economy to deal with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. And then the $831 billion we spent in 2009, this was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act after the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. So these are examples of discretionary fiscal policies, specific actions done by Congress on a discretionary basis. They could have done them or not done them. They chose, in these cases, to do them, which is different than the automatic fiscal policy. They pass a law. Anytime an event happens that meets a certain criteria, then the spending will happen. So the goal of this is to increase production, increase aggregate demand, increase employment, and increase economic activity overall. That's the idea behind fiscal stimulus and fiscal policy. So we have to remember that all fiscal policy is subject to a multiplier, which works in both directions. So if we add some government spending to the economy, let's say we add $1 worth of government spending, then the end result of that is going to be more than $1 to the and it goes back to the idea in Keynes and the DAS model about the marginal propensity to consume. The dollar gets spent by the government with the first person. He spends some and saves some. The amount he spends with the third person, that person spends some and saves some. So you keep working it through. If the government spends an initial $1, then you're going to have, because of the multiplier, and all spending is subject to a multiplier, you're going to have a greater amount of spending that happens than just the initial $1. And if you were to take a dollar out of the economy, you'd have more than the dollar coming out of the economy for the same reason. So the multiplier works in both directions. All fiscal policy, all spending and all taxes are subject to the multiplier. So we can see an example here. If there's an increase in government spending, this increases the real GDP, because the GDP is, G is one of the government spending is one of the components of GDP. This will increase people's incomes. It'll increase consumption expenditure and aggregate demand, and so the multiplier is greater than 1. If the government adds money to the economy, it's going to add it's going to add more than if it adds $1 to the economy, it's going to add more than $1. But we have to remember that the dollar the government spends comes from somewhere. They have to either increase taxes, which takes $1 out of the economy, or they have to borrow, which raises interest rates, which reduces private sector borrowing and investments. So the increase in government spending adds to the economy. The taxes that are used to pay for it, or the loans which increase interest rates, subtract something to the economy. And so in the end, when we look at the two of those effects together, we have to say which one's stronger. Well, it depends. It depends. The adding money to the economy by the government may be stronger than the money that gets taken out to pay for it, or the money gets taken out to pay for it may have a bigger negative impact than the spending. It depends on the circumstances, and we can see this. So taxes, when we increase taxes, for example, it drives a wedge between the cost of labor and take-home pay, meaning workers, when taxes are increased, get less than they used to get after the new taxes are considered. This is also true with borrowing. The people who are making the loans will get less than they would have. So taxes, tax increases, the net effect of them is they reduce employment, they reduce the amount of savings and investment in the economy, and they decrease real GDP and the growth of the economy. When we take money out of the economy through taxes, we're reducing economic activity, and a tax cut has the opposite effect. So if you want to stimulate the economy, if you want to stimulate aggregate demand and economic activity, well, a tax cut will help you increase employment and savings and investment. Thereby increasing real GDP and growth. And so if you use taxes to pay for additional government spending, the additional government spending adds something to the economy, but the increase in taxes used to pay for it subtracts something to the economy. And so the question is, which one is stronger? And in a general sense, it really depends. But if we look historically, the supply side effect, the amount of taxes, the higher taxes, they probably dominate the demand side effect. So you're taking more out of the economy from the private sector with higher taxes than you are by adding back to the economy through government spending. And this is one of the reasons why, from an economic and budget standpoint, we want to have taxes be lower, or as low as they can be, in order to promote economic activity. And so here we can see, using graphs, this same thing, how income taxes will reduce employment. After the tax, the supply of labor decreases because people get less take-home pay. And so you can what you see is less employment and higher real wages. So the quantity of labor decreases. We can see right here, and we know that One of the factors of production is the amount of labor that's being that's working. So the less labor there is, the less economic activity there is, the less GDP there is. And so when we increase taxes on income, then we decrease the quantity of labor that gets hired and employed and contributing to economic activity and GDP. It's also the case that when we increase taxes, we're not only, and this shows on this chart how when we're decreasing employment, we're also decreasing real GDP. The potential GDP declines. We move from this point to this point, and so a lot of times we look at the positive effects of spending that the government might do, but there are negative effects also. And we have to look at both of those effects, both the positive effects of incremental spending and the negative effects of increased taxes or increased rates for borrowing. Increased taxes and increased rates for borrowing will decrease the amount of employment and the amount of investment that goes on, which decreases economic activity. If we look now at the fact that people don't only get, so it's not only income taxes that rise, but it's also consumption taxes that have to play a factor. So we can see that when we add the sales taxes, and this is just a crude example, if somebody makes $100, they might pay $25 in income taxes and $10 when they purchase goods and services. So the real purchasing power is not $100, but $65. And so you can imagine when these numbers go up, the tax rates or sales taxes, the purchasing power that's left over is less. So the incentive to work is less. So the sales taxes and consumption taxes are also part of this equation. When there's higher sales taxes, higher consumption taxes, you have less employment. When you have less employment, you have less economic activity, you have less production, lower GDP, lower growth, and all those things that we talked about. And so the idea here is that we have to make sure as economists that we're looking at all the benefits and costs, not just the incremental spending that the government does and the benefits that brings, but the negative effects of the increased taxes or the increased interest rates from borrowing that happen as a way of paying for the increase in government spending. And the same thing happens when we have taxes on capital. Rates on capital now are low. We have a special rate for capital gains, which are gains that are held on investments that are longer than 1 year, but that wasn't always the case. And we had higher tax capital gains rates in the past. One of the things being discussed today, often discussed, is to reinstitute higher gains on capital gains. And so what you'll see there is if we increase the taxes on investments, then you'll see a reduction in both savings and investment. The returns will be lower for savings and investment. And so when the returns are lower, then we're going to see less. We're going to see a lesser amount of savings and investment, and this has a negative impact on the economy, on economic activity and GDP. And so we can see, in this example, if we currently have a 10% tax rate on capital gains, then the after-tax return is $90. If we were to raise the tax rate to 20%, then the after-tax return would be $80. So in savers and investors who might be inclined to loan money and to allow to people to borrow it and make investments, who are willing to do it at $90, some of them will not be willing to do it at $80. And so the result of that is we see the supply of loanable funds decreasing when you increase the tax on savings and investments. So this is another type of tax wedge that you have when you tax savings and investment at higher rates in one period versus another period. And so, taxes and tax rates are a complicated thing. For a long time, we thought, well, if we raise the tax rates, the government will be able to bring in more tax revenue. And certainly more tax revenue is an important thing for the government. Now we're running chronic deficits and running up such great debts. But as Arthur Laffer showed us with the Laffer Curve, it's a little more complicated than that. When you raise tax rates, you don't always get greater tax revenues. So if you're at the lower part of the chart here and you raise tax rates, you'll get more revenue. But if your tax rates are already high, let's say you're at point C here, and you raise the rates, well, then you'll get less tax revenue. So the point of the Laffer curve is that there's an optimal tax rate that maximizes the tax revenue. If you're at the lower, if your tax rate is too low and you raise tax rates, yes, you will increase tax revenue. But if you're on the point of the curve B or above, then raising tax rates will actually reduce tax revenue. And the idea here is that when tax rates get too high, people invest their time and energy into avoiding taxes. They might not work or go into business in the way they would have if tax rates are too high. They may not be profitable to take certain risks and go into certain endeavors if tax rates are too high. Or people might have a higher and greater incentive to evade taxation through the black market and hiding money and different things like that. So this was an important idea, the idea in the Laffer curve, and it's a very simple idea. It just means the Laffer curve just basically says that there's an optimal tax rate, and you can't. Raising tax rates won't necessarily increase tax revenues. It depends where you are on the curve. If you're on the upper part of the curve, then raising tax rates will actually decrease tax revenues, and this is one of the justifications for decreasing taxes. Sometimes, if you decrease taxes, you can increase tax revenues. Now, let's talk a little bit more about fiscal stimulus. When Congress goes and they decide they're going to create some fiscal stimulus to achieve macroeconomic objectives, there are significant time lags that they have to deal with, and it's not easy to deal with them. First of all, there's a certain lag between the time when economic events happen and for them to discover that they really need to take an action. It's not always obvious, especially in the beginning, that you may not need to take an action. Second thing is, it takes a long time to make laws. Sometimes it takes a few months or longer, maybe a year or longer than that. So the process of making laws in Congress to pass fiscal policy and laws aimed at fiscal policy can sometimes take quite a long time. And then the last thing is there's an impact lag. Even once you spend the money, it doesn't work its way through the economy right away. It takes a while for itself to work its way through the economy. And so all of these delays frustrate the process of successful fiscal policy, certainly in terms of trying to have an impact on the economy and achieve an impact on macroeconomic objectives. If these lags and delays are too long, well, then it may not work so well. There's a lot of debate among economists about, when you're doing a stimulus package, how big should it be? What's the magnitude of the stimulus package? After the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the stimulus package was in the $900 billion range, and one of the criticisms was, well, maybe it's not big enough. Maybe that the crisis was bigger than that. Maybe we need to inject and spend more money in order for it to work. It's certainly one of the motivations in 2020 and 2021 with the the stimulus packages passed related to the coronavirus, they were big. They were $2 and $3 trillion, and so that's this idea. But we don't really know. There's not really any good way to figure out after we spend the money how successful was it? How was it the right amount? Was it too much? Was it too little? Because the actual output gap is we don't really ever know it. We have to estimate it, and then it takes us a period of time. Maybe it's gotten bigger, maybe it's gotten smaller. This is a process that's inherently subject to error, and there's still today lots of controversy about how big should a stimulus package be when we do one? How much money do we have to spend in order to make fiscal policy work? And there's not a lot of agreement amongst economists on how much is too much or how much is too little. And then lastly, the discretionary fiscal policy is a difficult business, even with the brightest economists and the best lawmakers and the best of conditions. It's risky. It creates lots of unintended consequences, as we saw. In order to increase government spending, you're pulling money out of some other part of the economy, the private sector, out of by having higher taxes or by borrowing and having impacts on rates and future debt. So this is fiscal policy is a very difficult thing to do. Oftentimes it fails, and maybe the worst thing about it is after you do it, you often don't necessarily know if it succeeded or failed. There's lots of arguments or disagreements on whether something on what success is and what failure looks like. So fiscal policy is the main tool that we have in macroeconomics, and but it's even in the best of times, fiscal policy is difficult to carry out. And that's our lecture on fiscal policy.